now recognize Representative Dan Muser of Pennsylvania for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do appreciate my colleagues' remarks very much. And sirs, thank you very much for your testimony, service to our country, and for your what I consider to be very, very honorable responses here. That being said, the Biden administration's flawed execution of the withdrawal from Afghanistan has been a disastrous situation and with terrible consequences. Those with deep terrorist ties are now leading Afghanistan, and gives us great reason for grave concern. Ambassador Crocker, you and ranking member McCall penned an op-ed in New York Times in May. She said it was likely that the Taliban would take control of the country and urging the Biden administration to engage regional partners and protect our embassy. Based upon the testimony last week, it's clear that Generals McKenzie and Milley recommended leaving a residual force of 2,500 troops in Afghanistan, which would have been enough, according to General McKenzie, to keep Bagram. In your view, why did the administration, this is to Ambassador Crocker, why, in your view, did the Biden administration follow the course it did? What did you know that the Biden administration either did not know or did not acknowledge?
I cannot speak to what the Biden administration knew or didn't know or did or didn't do, clearly. It seems to me, though, that the president was determined to get out of Afghanistan, period, to get it off his plate. If you don't have deployed forces, it's a second-tier issue. Somebody else can worry about it. And I fear that that blinded him to some of the obvious consequences.
While the risks were somewhat clear that there would be an overrun by a terrorist group, that's just hard to digest. General McMaster, yeah. You also wrote a Wall Street Journal op-ed at the end of July that the conditions in Afghanistan exposed the flawed assumptions of the Biden administration's plan. In the same article, you suggest the United States should not adhere to the Doha Agreement, so that the Taliban was clearly violating the agreement itself. Why did, in your view, General, the Biden administration proceed with the withdrawal as planned? I guess that's a similar question to Ambassador Crocker, but what is your thought? Why would they proceed with the information that was at hand?
Well, I'm not sure what they were thinking, but I do think it was because they prioritized withdrawal, as Ambassador Crocker said, and then as a result didn't consider, what I think were quite obvious disastrous consequences associated with that precipitous withdrawal. And then this whole idea that we had to adhere to an agreement with the Taliban that they were breaking since it was inked in February of 2020 when they were engaged in a massive assassination campaign. Remember the bombing of the girls' schools. Remember the attack on a maternity hospital and the other mass murder attacks across the country as the intimidation began after we gave them our schedule for withdrawal. So I think the idea that we had to adhere to this agreement to keep good faith with the Taliban is actually just ludicrous.
Thank you. What about accountability? I want to ask you about accountability. The American people, my constituents, are very, very frustrated. They're demanding some sort of accountability. And then we see, of course, Lieutenant Colonel Scheller is in the brig, receiving accountability and penalties for calling out the mistakes that were made. And granted, we know that there was some violations in there. The treatment seems overly harsh, to say the least. But what about accountability for what's occurred here in Afghanistan, in its aftermath, in the withdrawal, in the deaths of soldiers? Are we going to allow the same who are making these decisions to continue making decisions? Will we see, in your view, General, any accountability?
Well, I think for the military, what's really important is to keep the bold line in place between our military and partisan politics and partisan political issues or just political issues broadly. Nobody elects generals or lieutenant colonels to make policy. And I think it's important for those who are serving in uniform, in particular, to understand their role, right, and who they are and what their role is. Their job is to do the best they can to execute the orders that they're given at the lower levels, but also to give your chain of command the benefit of your best advice. If you think something is really, really screwed up, you can sound off, but you do it through your chain of command, not to influence policy outside of your chain of command, because you're not accountable to the American people. In doing that, in trying to have this loud voice in a way that influences policy as a serving military officer, I believe you actually undermine the Constitution of the United States. So I guess the question is, and I've seen some of the hearings in the Senate and in the House on this with the Armed Services Committee, really just trying to determine, was best military advice accessed by the president? I wrote a book on why Vietnam became an American war. And during that period, Lyndon Johnson got the military advice he wanted and structured his relationship with the senior military to get what he wanted to hear. Was this a case with President Biden? I don't know. And I think that certainly Congress is going to help determine better how these decisions were made and what advice was given.
Thank you, Chair.